The lamp was still burning when Thomas Brenner rode in from the dark. Josephine Dugan stood at the porch of the Dugan farmhouse with her arms crossed over her chest, her breath fogging in the cold October air of 1882, her eyes fixed on the single rider coming down the hill with the moon at his back. She had not gone to bed. She had not even tried. She had sat in her father's chair by the window for 3 hours after the sheriff's deputy had come to her door and told her, with something too close to satisfaction in his voice, that the Dugan deed had been stolen from the county record's office in Caldwell, Kansas. He had told her that without that deed, the bank had no legal reason to hold the creditors at bay any longer. He had told her that she had until the 1st of November to vacate the property that her father had built with his hands and watered with his sweat for 22 years. He had tipped his hat and ridden away, and Josephine had stood in the doorway watching the dust from his horse settle back onto the dry October ground, and she had not cried. She had decided, somewhere in the hollow space behind her ribs, that she had no more tears left for men who brought bad news with smiles on their faces. She had lit the lamp and put it on the post at the edge of the porch, the way her father used to do when he was expecting someone late, and she had waited. She did not know what she was waiting for. She only knew that the moment the deputy had said the name Thomas Brenner, had mentioned it in passing, a slip of tongue, corrected too quickly, something had shifted inside her. Something cold and certain had settled into place. Now the rider came through the gate at the edge of the property, and even in the dark she knew the shape of him. Broad shoulders under a long trail coat, the brim of his hat pulled low, his horse a dark bay that moved with the tired patience of an animal that had covered serious ground. Thomas Brenner, the man who had disappeared from Caldwell 6 years ago with warrants on his name, and a reputation that people in this town still spoke in lowered voices. The man who had grown up 3 properties down from the Dugan farm, who had taught a 12-year-old Josephine to track a rabbit by its prints in the mud, and who had ridden away into whatever dark territory outlaws rode into, and never once looked back. Or so she had believed. He pulled the horse up at the edge of the lamp's light and sat there for a moment without speaking, and she looked at him the way you look at something that has come back from a place you were certain held no returns. His face was older. There were new lines around his eyes, a scar along his jaw that had not been there before, and something in his expression that looked like a man who had rehearsed 100 different versions of this moment, and found that all of them were inadequate now that he was actually in it. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, and he leaned forward from the saddle and held it out toward her. The deed. She could see the official seal even in the lamplight, the stamp of the Sumner County recorder's office, her father's name in faded ink across the top. She looked at the deed. She looked at him. She did not ask him where he had gotten it. She did not ask him how he had known it was missing, or who had taken it, or what it had cost him to get it back. She took it from his hand with fingers that barely trembled, and she held it against her chest, and she asked no questions. And that silence, that deliberate and chosen silence, was the first true thing that had passed between them in 6 years. He had not expected it to undo him the way it did. It was the spring of 1876 when Thomas Brenner first understood that Josephine Dugan was going to be a problem for him. Not a problem in the simple sense. Not a problem that could be solved by distance or discipline or any of the rational strategies he had applied successfully to every other complication in his 21 years of life. She was 17, and she had walked into the field where he was mending the fence line between their properties with a tin pail of water, and a look of complete self-possession that he had never seen on anyone quite that young, and she had set the pail down and said, without preamble, "You are doing that wrong. The post goes 2 inches deeper, or it pulls loose in the first hard rain." She had been correct. He had thanked her with the particular stiffness of a young man who has just been corrected by someone he was not prepared to take correction from, and she had smiled a small, private smile that was not unkind, and walked back across the field with the empty pail swinging at her side, and Thomas Brenner had driven the post 2 inches deeper and tried very hard not to watch her go. He was the third son of William Brenner, who had come from County Cork with nothing but a strong back and a determination to die owning land rather than working someone else's, and who had built a farm in Sumner County, Kansas, in the years after the Civil War when land was cheap, and the future was a thing a man could theoretically still shape with his own hands. William Brenner had died in the winter of 1873, before Thomas was old enough to understand what the loss of a father meant beyond the practical fact of it, and the farm had passed to his eldest brother Cormac, and Thomas had found himself in that particular position that third sons occupy in families where there is too little land and too many mouths, useful, but without a clear purpose of his own. He had taken work where he could find it. He was good with horses and better with his hands, and he had a quality that people either trusted immediately or mistrusted for the same reason, a kind of stillness. He did not waste words. He did not waste motion. He watched situations with the patient attention of someone who understood that most crises announced themselves well before they arrived, if you were paying attention. He had been paying attention to Josephine Dugan for 3 years before he admitted it to himself, not in a predatory way, not even in a conscious way at first. She was his neighbor's daughter, 6 years younger than him, and he had watched her grow from a girl who could out-argue her father's ranch hand on points of horse husbandry into a young woman who ran the household books with a precision that would have shamed most bank clerks. Her father, Patrick Dugan, had been widowed when Josephine was 9, and rather than remarry quickly, the way most widowed men did out of practical necessity, if nothing else, he had simply handed his daughter increasing responsibility, year by year, until she was running the farm's finances at 14 and negotiating contracts with buyers from Wichita at 16. Thomas had admired Patrick Dugan. He had also been quietly terrified of the daughter Patrick had raised. In the autumn of 1876, when Josephine was 17 and Thomas was 23, a man named Harlan Voss had arrived in Sumner County. Harlan Voss was the kind of man that the West in that era produced in abundance, educated enough to be dangerous, connected enough to be untouchable, and possessed of a moral architecture so flexible it could accommodate any shape that served his interests. He had come from St. Louis with money behind him, and a plan to consolidate property along the southern stretch of Sumner County that the railroad had not yet reached but would reach, and soon, if Harlan Voss's information was correct. The railroad meant everything. It meant land prices that would multiply 10 times over in a decade. It meant that a man who owned the right parcels now would be extraordinarily wealthy by 1890. The Dugan farm sat on exactly the right parcel. Harlan Voss had come to Patrick Dugan with an offer. Patrick Dugan had refused it. Harlan Voss had come again with a larger offer, and Patrick Dugan had refused that too, with the particular firm courtesy of a man who has been polite to people he did not like for long enough that it has become second nature. Harlan Voss had smiled both times and gone away, and Patrick Dugan had told Thomas about it over the fence line one evening with the casual tone of a man who believed the matter was settled. Thomas had not believed the matter was settled. He knew the type. He had seen enough of men like Harlan Voss to understand that refusal was not an outcome they accepted. It was merely a delay that prompted a different method. He had been right. In the winter of 1877, Patrick Dugan had taken sick. Not dramatically sick, not the kind of sickness that announced itself with crisis and urgency, but the slow, relentless kind that drains a man over months until one morning he simply cannot rise from bed. Josephine had managed everything. She had managed it with a competence that moved Thomas to something that he still refused to name properly, but that lived in his chest like a low, persistent warmth. She had managed the livestock and the accounts and the spring planting and her father's medications and the negotiations with the bank that held the mortgage, and she had done all of it without asking for help from anyone. She had, however, allowed Thomas to help her when he simply appeared and began helping without asking permission. He had understood, instinctively, that asking would have made her feel weak. Appearing with a wagon load of winter feed and beginning to unload it was a different proposition entirely. She had looked at him from the barn door with those dark eyes and said, "I did not ask for that." And he had said, "No, you did not," and continued unloading. And after a moment she had picked up the other end of the first bale and helped him carry it inside. That was how it had been between them in those months. A collaboration that was careful to call itself nothing. A proximity that both of them maintained with a discipline that cost more than either of them acknowledged. Patrick Dugan had died in March of 1878. Josephine had been 19. Thomas had been 25. Patrick had left the farm to Josephine outright, bypassing the expectation that he would find someone to marry her and transfer the property to a husband in the customary way. It was an unusual arrangement for the time and the place, and it had caused a certain amount of talk in town that Josephine had ignored with the complete indifference of a woman who had never needed town's approval for anything. The deed was registered in the Sumner County Record's office with Josephine Eileen Dugan as sole owner, and Thomas had stood in the doorway of the record's office and watched her sign the papers with the particular composed gravity of someone who is too aware of what it has cost to arrive at this moment to feel anything as simple as happiness. She had looked up from the papers and found him watching, and something had crossed her face that she had quickly reordered into composure. But he had seen it. Whatever it was, something raw and grateful and complicated, he had seen it. And then Harlan Voss had moved. Not immediately. Voss was patient in the way that predators are patient. He had waited 3 months after Patrick Dugan's death before he had approached Josephine directly, and when he had come with a more personal offer. He had come with a courtship. Thomas had been returning from Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon when he had passed the Dugan farm and seen Harlan Voss's black buggy at the gate. He had pulled his horse up without thinking and sat there at the side of the road for a long moment, watching the house. He could see them on the porch, Josephine in her dark dress with her hair pulled back, and Voss in his town clothes, leaning forward in the way that men lean forward when they are working at something. He had ridden on. He had told himself it was none of his business. She was a grown woman who had demonstrated her ability to manage her own affairs with more competence than most men he knew. She did not need him intervening in her personal life. She had not asked for his opinion on Harlan Voss, and she had not offered to share her feelings about the man's visits, which meant she did not want Thomas Brenner's involvement. He had told himself this several times over the following 2 weeks, during which Harlan Voss visited the Dugan farm 3 more times. On a Thursday evening in the middle of July 1878, Josephine had appeared at the Brenner property, at the fence line specifically, where Thomas was working late in the long summer light, and she had said without looking at him, "Thomas, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to just listen for a moment before you say anything." He had stopped working and given her his full attention. She had told him that Harlan Voss had been very clear that his interest in her was not entirely separate from his interest in the farm. She had told him that Voss had, in the course of his last visit, allowed certain things to become evident, the way that a man who is negotiating allows the edges of his real position to show when he believes he is close to an agreement. He had spoken of the railroad. He had spoken of the farm's location. He had spoken of what a partnership, a marriage, would mean for both of them financially. Josephine had stood at the fence in the summer evening with her chin up and her jaw tight, and she had said, "I am not a land transaction. I want to make certain that someone else knows that I have told him so." Thomas had looked at her for a long moment. He had thought about every careful, disciplined thing he had told himself over the preceding months about her competence and her independence and her absolute right to manage her own life without his interference. He had said, "Josephine." She had looked at him. He had said, "If that man comes onto your property again and makes you feel like a line item in a business ledger, I want you to come and get me." She had held his gaze for a moment that was longer and more complicated than either of them had vocabulary for, and then she had nodded once and walked back toward the house. Harlan Voss had come back. What happened next had become the story that people in Caldwell and Sumner County told in versions that varied depending on who was telling them and what they wished the truth to be. The version that the sheriff had put in his report was that Thomas Brenner had threatened a legitimate businessman in front of witnesses, had struck him when the argument escalated, and had fled when confronted with arrest. The version that Thomas carried in his own chest was more complicated and more expensive. Harlan Voss had not merely come back to court Josephine. He had come back with 2 men from St. Louis, men who had a particular quality that Thomas recognized immediately when he saw them on the road from Caldwell, the quality of men who are hired for their willingness to do things that other men will not do. And they had not come to the Dugan farmhouse through the front gate. They had come around the back, through the south field at dusk. Thomas had been returning from Caldwell and had seen the buggy and the 2 riders taking the back way, and something in him had turned to ice. He had not gone home. He had cut across the field at a gallop and arrived at the back of the Dugan property, just as Voss and his men had cornered Josephine in the barn with a document and a demand that she sign over the deed in exchange for what Voss had called a fair negotiated price. But what the 2 men standing at the barn door made clear was not optional. Thomas had dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. What had happened in that barn had resolved the situation, but had also ended Thomas Brenner's life in Sumner County as effectively as if he had been killed there. One of Voss's men had produced a weapon. Thomas had responded to that. Voss had fallen. The weapon had discharged into the barn wall. Both of Voss's men had fled. Voss himself had been unhurt but had been left in no doubt about the consequences of returning, and he had taken his bruised pride and his St. Louis connections and gone to the sheriff before Thomas could collect his thoughts. Thomas had been facing arrest by morning. He had gone to the Dugan farmhouse at midnight, the first midnight, not the one that matters most to this story, and he had stood at the door, and Josephine had been waiting there with the lamp lit, because she had heard everything, and she was not a woman who went to bed in the middle of a crisis. And he had told her he had to go. He had told her that if he stayed, Voss would bury him in a legal proceeding that Voss would control because Voss had the sheriff's ear and Thomas had nothing but his own word. He had told her that he was sorry. She had looked at him with those dark eyes in the lamplight, and she had said very quietly, "You came for me." He had said, "Yes." She had reached out and put her hand flat against his chest for a moment, just for a moment, and then she had taken it away. She had said, "Go then. Go fast." He had gone. He had spent 6 years as precisely the thing the warrants named him, an outlaw. Not a romanticized outlaw, not the kind of mythologized figure that the dime novels were already manufacturing in abundance, but a man living outside the structure of the law in a country where the law was not always separable from the men who held the badges. He had worked cattle drives and freight runs, and a few things on the edges of legal that he preferred not to examine too closely in retrospect. He had moved through Texas and New Mexico territory and up through Colorado and back, always moving, always watching, always maintaining the discipline that kept a man alive when he had no institutional protection. He had thought about Josephine Dugan with the kind of persistent frequency that he had given up fighting by the 2nd year, and had simply learned to carry. The way you learn to carry a stone in your shoe when there is nowhere to sit and remove it. The way the weight of a thing becomes so familiar that its absence would be strange. He had kept an ear to news from Sumner County, the way a man keeps an ear to the sound of his own name in a crowd. He had learned, through the particular network of people who traffic in information along the cattle routes and whiskey roads of the southern plains, that Harlan Voss had not gone away. He had regrouped. He had found a different method. And the different method, as of the autumn of 1882, had involved someone in the county record's office in Caldwell, and a stolen deed, and a sheriff's deputy who was on Voss's payroll and who had delivered the news of the deed's absence to Josephine Dugan with something that was almost gloating in his face. Thomas had gotten the information on a Monday. He had ridden from the Texas Panhandle to Sumner County in 4 days, which was approximately 4 days of riding that a man only does when something is pulling at him with the force of gravity. He had retrieved the deed from the man in the records office who had taken it retrieved it, in a manner that had involved a certain amount of the compelling persuasion that 6 years of living outside the law had equipped him for, without violence, though the threat of it had been present in the room like a third party. He had ridden to the Dugan farm, and he had come through the gate in the dark, with the lamp burning at the post on the porch and Josephine standing in its light. Now, in the cold October midnight of 1882, Thomas Brenner sat on his horse with the deed transferred from his hand to hers, and the silence between them full of 6 years of things that neither of them had found a way to say. He should have ridden on. He was still wanted in Sumner County. The warrants from 1878 had not expired. If the deputy came back in the morning and found him here, the situation would become considerably more complicated. The rational action was to hand over the deed, say whatever brief necessary thing needed saying, and get back on the road before daylight. Josephine looked up from the deed and said, "You look terrible." He blinked. After everything. After the midnight and the lamplight and the wait of 6 years. That was what she said. He said, "I have been riding for 4 days." She said, "Come inside." He said, "Josephine, there are warrants," she said. "I know about the warrants. Come inside." He got down from the horse. She tied his horse at the post and held the door open for him, and he stepped into the Dugan farmhouse for the first time in 6 years and found it exactly as he remembered and completely different. The same wide kitchen with the iron stove and the scrubbed table, the same shelf of her father's books, the same window looking south toward the Brenner property, which had been sold by Cormac in 1880 and now belonged to a family from Ohio. But there were Josephine's additions. A set of accounting ledgers stacked precisely on the corner of the table, a pressed flower in a frame on the wall that had not been there before, curtains in a particular shade of dark blue that suggested someone who had thought deliberately about what she wanted in her own space. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, and she set the deed on the table and put the kettle on the stove, and then turned to look at him with the full weight of her attention, the way she had always been able to look at things, directly, without apology, without the social deflection that most people used to make examination comfortable. She said, "How did you know it was missing?" He said, "I keep informed." She said, "About me specifically or about Sumner County generally?" He looked at her. He said, "About you specifically." She absorbed this without visible reaction, but something shifted in the air between them, some small tectonic thing. She said, "For how long?" He said, "The whole time." The kettle began to make the preliminary sounds of heating. Outside, the wind moved through the dry October grass with a sound like breathing. Josephine stood at the stove with her back to him for a moment, and he could see the set of her shoulders, not rigid, not defensive, but careful. The posture of a person thinking through something with great precision. She turned around and said, "Thomas, why did you come back? You could have sent someone with the deed. You could have had it posted. Why did you ride 4 days yourself?" He had several answers prepared for this question. He had prepared them during those 4 days of riding, which had provided ample time for rehearsal. He had prepared answers that were sensible and bounded, and that did not require him to make himself as vulnerable as the truth would make him. He had prepared answers that were technically accurate but did not expose the real thing. He said, "Because it was you." The kitchen was very quiet. Josephine poured the hot water into the cups with the steadiness of a woman who does not let her hands shake when she is feeling something difficult, and she brought both cups to the table and sat down, and gestured for him to sit across from her. He took the chair across from her. They sat with the deed between them like a third presence, and the lamp burning on the table and the cold October night pressing at the windows. She said, "Tell me what happened with Voss, with the deed." He told her. He told her about the network of information he had built over 6 years of living outside the law, the way certain names connected to certain movements and certain money, and how Harlan Voss's name had surfaced attached to a property scheme in Sumner County that was older than most people realized. He told her that Voss had never given up on the Dugan land, had simply been patient in the infuriating way of men with money and time, and had found an avenue through the county record's office, a clerk named Aldridge who had a gambling debt that Voss had purchased along with the clerk's loyalty. He told her that the deed had been taken 2 weeks ago, which had given Voss time to arrange the bank pressure through channels that were difficult to trace. She listened to all of this with her hands wrapped around the cup and her eyes on him, not the restless listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the deep, genuine listening of a person who is actually taking in what they're hearing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And Aldridge," he said, "the deed is back. Aldridge understands that returning it was in his considerable interest." She said, "And Voss," he said, "Voss has other problems tonight." He paused and added, "Legal ones. There are men in the county record's office in Caldwell who had questions about certain financial arrangements that came to light during my visit to Aldridge. I expect there will be a warrant issued by morning that has Voss's name on it rather than mine." She looked at him steadily. She said, "You maneuvered that," he said. "I had the evidence. I simply arranged for it to be presented to the right people." She said, "That must have taken preparation." He said, "Yes," she said, "you planned this before you left Texas." He said, "Yes," she said, "you planned to clear your name at the same time you retrieved the deed." He said, "The warrants against me were always connected to Voss. When Voss goes down, the circumstances of 1878 become considerably clearer to anyone who examines them." She was quiet again. Then very quietly she said, "You protected me in 1878 and it cost you everything, and now you have spent 6 years carrying that cost, and now you have come back and cleared the debt for both of us in one move." He said, "You did not need protecting. You were managing." She said, "I was, but you came anyway." He said, "Yes." She looked at him with those dark eyes in the lamplight, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen there. He had seen her composed, and he had seen her professionally measured, and he had seen her briefly and frighteningly close to breaking. That one moment at the fence line in the summer of 1878, when she had told him about Voss's real intentions, and her voice had only barely remained steady. But he had never seen her face look exactly like this, which was the face of a person who has decided to let themselves want something. She said, "Thomas, I am going to say something and I am going to ask you to simply hear it and not respond immediately, because I have been waiting 6 years to say it and I would like to say it without interruption." He nodded. She said, "I have been angry with you for leaving. Not for having to leave. I understood the warrants, I understood Voss's influence, I understood all of the practical reasons. I have been angry because you left without telling me what I was to you. You came to my door at midnight, and you said you had to go, and I put my hand on your chest because I could not think of another way to say what I needed to say, and I did not know if you understood it. And then you rode away, and I have spent 6 years not knowing if what existed between us was something real or only something I had constructed out of wishful thinking and proximity." The lamp burned steadily. She said, "I need to know which one it was." He said, "Josephine," she said, "I said no interruptions." He said, "I know, but I cannot sit here and let you think for another second that it was wishful thinking." She looked at him. He said, "I have been in love with you since you corrected my fence post in 1876 and walked away with that pail. And I have spent every day of the 6 years since I left working out how to come back to you in a way that did not make your life harder than it already was. And that is not a romantic reason for staying away, but it was the honest one." The kitchen was very, very quiet. She said, "You have been in love with me since 1876. He said, "Since the fence post." "Yes," she said, "that is 7 years, Thomas." He said, "I know how long it is." She pressed her lips together for a moment, and he saw the shine that was not quite tears in her eyes, and he watched her hold herself together with the particular discipline that had always been both his deepest admiration for her and the thing about her that made him most desperate to give her a reason to put it down. She said, "You could have told me." He said, "You were 17. She said, "And then I was 18, and 19 and 20 and 21. He said, "And I was watching Voss and watching your father's health and watching you take on more than anyone should carry alone, and thinking that the last thing you needed was a man with no land and no prospects making declarations at you." She said, "That was not your decision to make." He said, "No, it was not. I was wrong." The admission sat between them, simple and undefended, and she looked at him with something that was not quite forgiveness but was the country just adjacent to it, and she said, "You are here now." He said, "I am here now." She said, "Are you staying?" He said, "If the warrant's clear and if there is a reason to stay, yes." She said, "There is a reason." He looked at her. She said, "There is a very specific and clearly articulated reason, which I believe you just heard, Thomas." He stood up from the table. He was not a man who moved impulsively. He was constitutionally the opposite of impulsive. But he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and she rose to meet him. And when he put his hands on her face, she was already tilting her chin up. And the first time he kissed Josephine Dugan, 7 years after he had fallen for her at a fence post on a summer afternoon, it was in the kitchen of her farmhouse at something past midnight on a cold October night in 1882. With the deed to the land on the table behind them, and the lamp burning and everything that had been the hidden, forbidden, impossible thing between them suddenly and completely possible. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him with color in her face and a complicated brightness in her eyes, and she said, "You have been riding for 4 days and you look absolutely dreadful." He laughed. He had not laughed like that in a very long time. She said, "There is a room at the back, my father's old room. You will sleep, and in the morning we will see what has happened in Caldwell with Voss and the warrants, and then we will decide what comes next." He said, "That is a very practical approach to a fairly significant moment." She said, "I am a very practical person." He said, "You are." She said, "Go to sleep, Thomas." He went. In the morning the news came before 10 o'clock. The deputy, the same deputy who had delivered the news of the missing deed with barely concealed satisfaction, arrived at the Dugan farmhouse with a very different quality of expression, which was the expression of a man who has been on the wrong side of something and knows that the wrong side is becoming visible. He had, without mentioning Thomas Brenner by name, informed Josephine that the deed had been returned to the county records office, that a clerk named Aldridge had confessed to the theft under circumstances the deputy declined to elaborate, and that Harlan Voss had been taken into custody the previous night on charges related to fraud and conspiracy involving land records in Sumner County. He had said, in a tone that was attempting neutrality and not quite achieving it, that the charges against Josephine Dugan's property were dissolved. Josephine had thanked him with perfect composure and closed the door. She had stood in the kitchen for a moment with her back against the door, and then she had said to Thomas, who was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that she had made while the deputy was talking, "Well," he said. "Well," she said, "the warrants against you." He said, "Voss's arrest changes the record significantly. The circumstances of 1878 will need to be re-examined. It will take some time, but I expect that by spring the warrants will have been resolved." She said, "You expected this." He said, "I planned for it." She looked at him with a quiet, warm appreciation that was different from anything she had turned on him the night before, less charged, more grounded, the appreciation of a person who is looking at someone they intend to know for a long time and finding the prospect not just acceptable but actively good. She said, "What will you do until spring?" He said, "That depends considerably on you." She poured him more coffee and sat down across from him and said, "I have 80 acres. The south field needs a new drainage ditch before the spring planting. The barn roof has a section that needs replacing before the first hard snow. I have a contract with a buyer in Wichita for half my corn yield next year that requires me to expand by at least 15 acres, which means clearing land before March. I have more work than I can do alone, and I have been doing it alone for 4 years. He said, "Are you offering me a job?" She said, "I am offering you considerably more than that, and you know it. But yes, initially, the practical arrangement would be that you are employed on the Dugan farm and living in the back room, and the arrangement would be entirely proper until such time as it can become something else." He said, "Something else meaning marriage." She met his eyes without flinching and said, "That is what I mean, yes." He said, "Josephine Dugan, will you marry me?" She said, "Thomas, we have known each other for 7 years and been in love for most of them. I am 23 years old and I have never wanted to marry anyone else. So the answer is yes, obviously, and I would appreciate it if you did not make me wait another 7 years." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that rearranges a face, the kind that makes you understand why the face belonged to before it looked this way was only an approximation. He said, "You will not have to wait." She said, "Good. Now drink your coffee and I will show you the drainage problem." The weeks that followed were the most quietly extraordinary of Thomas Brenner's adult life. He had spent 6 years in motion, always moving, always watching, always maintaining the alert watchfulness of a man who could not afford to settle, and settling was strange to him in the way that stillness is strange to a river. But the Dugan farm held him the way gravity holds a thing, with a force that was not coercive but simply fundamental. He worked from before dawn until after dark every day, and Josephine worked beside him, and there was a rhythm to it that felt like something he had not known he was missing. She knew the land the way you know a thing you have grown up alongside, not just what it needed but what it wanted, the particular quirks of the south field that ran wet in February, the way the north-facing slope needed to be left fallow every 3rd year, the behavior of the creek in hard weather. He brought different knowledge, the broader patterns of soil and water management he had picked up across the southern plains, the structural knowledge of barn building that he had acquired on a winter job in New Mexico, the way to negotiate freight contracts that left room for weather and delay. They argued about the drainage ditch. It was a good argument, the kind that comes from 2 competent people who have different but equally valid approaches to the same problem, and it ended with a solution that incorporated elements of both approaches and was better than either would have produced alone. And afterward they had stood in the field in the November cold looking at the trench they had marked out together, and Thomas had felt something that was not a word he usually applied to himself. He had felt at peace. In the evenings they sat at the kitchen table and Josephine would go through the accounts while Thomas read from the shelf of Patrick Dugan's books, and sometimes one of them would say something and the other would respond, and the conversation would unspool from there, ranging over everything from the practical, the price of seed corn, the reliability of the buyer in Wichita, to the things that mattered in a different register. He told her about the 6 years in pieces, and she listened without judgment but with complete attention, taking in every piece and placing it in her understanding of him with the careful precision she applied to everything. He learned in return that the years since her father's death had not been merely difficult in the obvious ways, but in the interior ways that do not show from the outside, the particular loneliness of being the person who manages everything and has no one to be managed by, even briefly. She told him, one evening in late November, that the hardest thing had not been the physical work or even the financial pressure, but the absence of someone who knew her. Not just knew about her, but knew her, the interior version, the one that existed behind the competence. He said, "I know you." She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them and said, "I know you do. You have always known me." "That is a large part of why I waited." He said, "You waited for me," she said. "I did not sit in a window sighing, if that is what you are imagining, but I did not encourage any other arrangement, and several men tried to arrange themselves in my direction over the years. There was a man from Wichita who was perfectly respectable. There was a veterinarian from Caldwell who was quite nice. I declined both of them. He said, because of me. She said, because they were not you, and I was not willing to settle for not you when I had spent 7 years knowing what you felt like to be near. He sat with this for a moment. Then he said, Josephine, I am sorry. I am genuinely sorry for what the 6 years cost you. I thought distance was protection. I should have found a way back sooner, she said. You found the way when you had a way to offer. I cannot be angry at you for that. He said, you were angry last night, she said. I am not now. He said, what changed? She said, I slept on it and I realized that angry is what I am when I am afraid, and I am not afraid anymore. Outside, the November wind was doing its steady, searching work against the windows. Inside, the stove was warm and the lamp was steady, and Thomas Brenner looked at the woman across the table and understood, with a clarity that required no analysis, that this was the central fact of his life and everything else was peripheral. He said, come here. She raised an eyebrow. She said, you come here. He got up and came there. He pulled her gently to her feet from the chair, and held her face in his hands, and kissed her with the particular quality of a man who is no longer restraining anything. And she kissed him back with the particular quality of a woman who has been patient long enough, and is done with patience. The warrant situation resolved itself in stages over the winter, as Thomas had calculated it would. With Harlan Voss in custody and facing charges that shone an unflattering light backward onto the events of 1878, the sheriff's office in Sumner County quietly reconsidered its records. A man named Deputy Marshal Calloway, who was the father of a friend from Thomas's cattle drive years, and who had been watching the Voss situation with interest from Wichita, intervened in a formal capacity in January of 1883. By February, the warrants against Thomas Brenner had been formally vacated on the grounds that the charges had been filed under circumstances that were now being characterized, with appropriate legal delicacy, as irregularities in the original investigation. He was a free man. He had stood outside the Caldwell courthouse on the day the papers were signed, with the cold February air on his face and the strange, enormous lightness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that its removal is temporarily disorienting. He had stood there for a moment, simply breathing, and then he had turned his horse back toward the Dugan farm. Josephine had known before he got through the gate. She had read it in the way he carried himself on the horse, the absence of the alert watchfulness that had been his constant companion since 1878. She had come out onto the porch without her coat in the February cold, and he had dismounted and walked up the porch steps, and she had looked at his face and said simply, "Truly over," he said, "truly over." She had stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he had held her in the winter afternoon with the bare trees casting long shadows across the yard, and there was nothing performative or careful about it. It was just two people holding each other after a long and difficult road, on the property that belonged to both of them, now in the way that a place belongs to the people who pour their lives into it. They were married in April. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister from Caldwell, in the front room of the Dugan farmhouse, with a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Josephine wore the dress her mother had made before she dyed a practical dark blue wool that had been altered and pressed with her hair down for the first time in memory, which was the kind of small, radical departure that meant everything and looked like nothing. Thomas wore the only suit coat he owned, which was clean and brushed and fit him well enough that the few women in attendance remarked on it in appreciative undertones. He held her hands at the front of the room and looked at her with the full, unhidden weight of everything he felt, and she looked back at him with those dark eyes in the April morning light and did not look away. And when the minister reached the part where he said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," Thomas Brenner kissed his bride with a tenderness that made the minister clear his throat and look at the ceiling, and made at least two of the neighbor women produce handkerchiefs. Afterward there was food and a fiddle player that one of the neighbors had brought, and the day had the quality of something long deferred finally arriving, which made everything in it taste better and sound brighter and feel more present. Late in the evening, when the guests had gone, and the front room was quiet with the remains of celebration, Josephine sat on the porch steps in the April dark with a shawl around her shoulders, and Thomas sat beside her, and they watched the first stars appear over the Kansas plain. His hand found hers without either of them directing the motion, the way breathing happens. She said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "The fence post." She laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded. She said, "You were doing it completely wrong." He said, "I know, I have thought about it with great embarrassment for 7 years." She said, "You were embarrassed." He said, "I was trying to impress you with my fence-building skill, which apparently I did not have." She said, "You impressed me anyway." He said, "With what?" She said, "You took the correction without arguing. Most men would have argued, you just drove the post deeper." He said, "I was right to take the correction." She said, "I know, but most men do not know when they are wrong." She paused and added, "You have always known when you are wrong. It is a quality I value very highly in a person." He looked at her in the starlight and said, "I was wrong to stay away as long as I did." She said, "Yes, but you are here now." He said, "Here and staying." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the April dark while the Kansas stars came out one by one, and the night settled around the farm with the particular quiet of a place that is being taken care of by people who love it. The spring planting went in ahead of schedule. The drainage ditch in the south field functioned precisely as they had argued it into existence, and the south field's yield that summer was the best since Patrick Dugan had planted it in 1869. Josephine's contract with the Wichita buyer expanded, because her reputation for reliable delivery and honest yield reporting had preceded her in ways she was too modest to recognize, but that Thomas observed and took a quiet satisfaction in. The barn roof held through a June storm that took several roofs in the county. The cleared north acreage produced its first harvest in September. They had not been idle in any sense. Thomas had discovered, in the course of that first year of marriage, that sharing a life with Josephine Dugan was exactly as challenging and rewarding as he had always suspected it would be. She had opinions about everything and was usually right, which was less irritating than it would have been in someone less willing to acknowledge when she was wrong, which was occasionally but never reluctantly. She had a precision in language that sometimes made him feel that he was being very gently cross-examined when she was simply making conversation. She had a habit of reading until the lamp burned low that he had given up addressing, because she simply ignored his suggestions that she sleep at a reasonable hour and was always awake before him in the morning regardless. She was the person he wanted to tell everything to, and the person he wanted beside him at the end of every day, and the fact of her specific, particular, irreplaceable Josephineness still caught him off guard sometimes when he looked up from whatever he was doing and found her across the room or across the field, going about her work with that complete self-possession, and he would feel something enormous and wordless that had no name except love, which was too small a word for it but was the one available. In the winter of 1883, Josephine told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the directness that characterized her approach to all significant information. She had looked at him and said, "Thomas, I believe we are going to have a child in the summer." He had been very still for a moment. Then he had set down his cup, crossed the kitchen, and held her very carefully, and she had put her face against his shoulder, and they had stood like that in the winter morning kitchen for a long time without speaking. He said into her hair, "Are you all right? Are you well?" She said, "I am perfectly well. I am also somewhat emotional, which is unusual for me and which I find slightly inconvenient." He said, "You are allowed to be emotional." She said, "I know I am allowed." I said, "I find it inconvenient. There is a difference." He pulled back and looked at her face. Her eyes were bright. He said, "Josephine, I am so glad." She said, "So am I," and then she added with a small and genuine smile, "I was not certain how you would respond." He said, "Did you think I would be anything other than glad?" She said, "I thought you would be glad. I also thought there was a possibility that the enormity of it might frighten you." He said, "It does frighten me, and I am glad. Both are true." She said, "Good. That is the appropriate response." He kissed her forehead and kept his hands on her shoulders and said, "Whatever you need, whatever makes this easier." She said, "At the moment, what I need is for you to finish the coffee you put down and to talk to me about whether we should expand the hen house before summer, because I have been doing the calculations on egg production and I think there is an opportunity there." He said, "You want to discuss the hen house?" She said, "I am expecting a child, Thomas, not incapacitated." "The farm does not stop." He said, "No, it does not." He picked up his cup and sat back down at the table and said, "Tell me about the hen house." She told him about the hen house. He listened to her lay out the egg production numbers with the love of a man who understands that this is love, not the declaration of it, but the willingness to sit across from the person you love at 7 in the morning and genuinely attend to the thing they care about, because they care about it. The baby came in July of 1884. It was a boy, which Josephine had predicted with the calm certainty of a woman who had apparently reached a private conclusion and not bothered to mention it. He was born in the farmhouse on a hot July morning with the assistance of the midwife from Caldwell, and Thomas had sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours in a state that no amount of preparedness had equipped him for, and that bore no resemblance to the composed watchfulness he had managed through every other difficult circumstance of his life. He had been, simply, terrified. And then the door had opened, and the midwife had come out and said, in the matter-of-fact tone of a woman for whom this was professional routine, "Healthy boy. Your wife would like to see you." And Thomas had gone through the door and found Josephine sitting up in the bed with a small person in her arms, looking at the small person with an expression that he had never seen on her face before and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to find words for. She had looked up when he came in and said, "Come and meet your son." He had come. He had sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy, who was very new and who had a strong opinion about his arrival that he was expressing with full volume. And Thomas had felt something happen in his chest that was not like anything else. He had reached out and the boy had closed his fingers around Thomas's index finger with a grip that was startling in its determination. And Thomas Brenner, who had ridden across 5 territories without flinching at anything, felt the tears come and did not try to stop them. Josephine watched him with the lamp on the bedside table and her son in her arms and her husband's face broken open with something too large for composure, and she reached over and put her hand against his cheek, and he turned and kissed her palm. She said, "I was thinking Patrick." He said, "Patrick Thomas." She said, "Yes." Patrick Thomas Brenner arrived in the world on the 22nd of July, 1884, and from his first day in the Dugan farmhouse, which was rapidly becoming the Brenner farm in the natural way of naming, though Josephine kept Dugan in the property records because it was her father's name, and she had a precise sense of what debts were owed to history. He was a person with intentions. He was loud and hungry and interested in everything, and growing at a rate that astonished Thomas, who had been intellectually aware that children grew, but had not expected it to feel this fast from the inside. He was also, from approximately 2 months of age, absolutely devoted to his father, which produced in Thomas a helpless and complete reciprocation. The farm continued to thrive. Thomas had taken on a hand, by the fall of 1884, a young man named Samuel Holt, who had come up from the Texas Panhandle, with good references, and a willingness to work that was genuine rather than performed, and with the additional labor, they had expanded the cleared acreage further north, had improved the barn significantly, and had begun the preliminary work on a small addition to the farmhouse that would give them a proper second bedroom for Patrick in. As Josephine noted with studied casualness one October evening, any future occupants. He had looked up from the carpentry diagram he was studying and said, "Josephine." She had not looked up from the ledger she was reviewing. She said, "We should plan for the additional space now. It is considerably easier to build ahead of need than during." He said, "Josephine, are you telling me something?" She had looked up then, and the expression on her face was the one she wore when she was attempting to be composed about something that was defeating her composure, and she said, "I am telling you that we should plan adequate space, yes." He got up from the table and went around to her side and kissed her, thoroughly, and she made a small sound that was half laugh and half something else. And Patrick, who was 3 months old and in his basket by the stove and had been asleep, chose this moment to announce himself, and Thomas laughed against her mouth, and Josephine shook with laughter that she was suppressing into his shoulder, and it was not the most romantic moment they had shared, but it was one of the truest. The second child, a daughter they named Clara Margaret Brenner, arrived in June of 1885. She was smaller than her brother had been and quieter by nature, which Josephine observed was a welcome variation, and she had Thomas's eyes, which Josephine pointed out with a satisfied air as though this confirmed some private theory. Clara was a watcher. She would lie in her basket and observe everything around her with an expression of serious, considered evaluation, and Thomas would look at her and see Josephine in miniature and feel the particular warmth of a man whose cup has so thoroughly run over that he cannot quite comprehend it. Patrick, who was 11 months when Clara arrived and had just begun to stand by gripping the table leg, greeted his sister with the benign confusion of someone who has been presented with something interesting but cannot yet determine its purpose. Over the following months, as he learned to walk and Clara learned to track sound, and then light, and then faces with her dark eyes, they achieved a sibling equilibrium that expressed itself primarily through Patrick's attempts to hand Clara objects she was not yet capable of grasping, which he did with a persistence that Thomas recognized as a family trait. Life on the Brenner farm in the late 1880s had a particular quality that Thomas would not have been able to describe adequately to anyone who had not experienced it, but that he understood as the thing people mean when they say they have found their place. Not a perfect life. The work was hard and the weather was unpredictable, and the economic pressures that attended farming in Kansas in that decade were real and constant, and there were seasons of worry and sleepless nights over yield and prices, and the persistent concern about whether the land would produce enough to meet what they owed to the bank. But it was a full life, a grounded life, a life organized around things that mattered. In the evenings, after the children were settled and the accounts were done, Thomas and Josephine would sit on the porch in the summer or by the stove in the winter, and they would talk or they would be quiet. And the quality of both the talking and the silence was the quality of two people who have learned each other thoroughly enough that neither is performing. He knew when she needed to talk through a problem, and when she needed simply to have him nearby. She knew when his silence was comfortable and when it was the kind that meant something was sitting heavily, and she would say without preamble, "Tell me," and he would. He told her things he had never told anyone. The specific texture of the 6 years on the trail, not just the external events, but the interior experience of a man who has been cut off from everything he cares about by his own actions, and the actions of a corrupt and greedy man. The guilt that had lived in him for the whole of those 6 years, the recurring thought that he had made the situation in 1878 worse by his response to it, even though his response had protected her. The way he had ridden through certain parts of Kansas in the intermediate years and had felt the pull of proximity to Sumner County like a physical sensation, and had turned his horse in the opposite direction because he had not yet found the way to come back cleanly. She listened to all of it, and she did not minimize it or rush past it, but she also did not let it sit between them as unresolved weight. She said, one night in the winter of 1886, "Thomas, the 6 years are over. They were what they were, and they cost what they cost, and the accounting is done. What we have is this." She had gestured at the room, at the children sleeping in the back, at the lamp and the stove and the accounts on the table. "This is what the cost was for," he said. "Yes," she said. "Is there any part of you that wishes you had chosen differently?" He thought about it honestly, the way she would have known if he had not. He said, "I wish I had found a better way to manage 1878. I do not wish I had stayed when I had warrants on me and Voss's influence behind them. I would have spent those 6 years in a territorial prison, and that would have been worse for you," she said. "It would have been," he said. "I wish I had found a way back sooner." She said, "You came when you could come with something clean to offer." He said, "I came when your name was in danger," she said. "You came when I needed you, and you brought me back the deed to my father's land. I cannot find fault with that." He said, "No questions asked." She looked at him with the quiet, warm steadiness that had become the most familiar and most essential landscape of his adult life. She said, "I have always known who you were, Thomas. I did not need the answers you had already given me in the act of returning." He said, "Josephine," she said. "What?" He said, "I love you." She said, "I know." And then, because she was Josephine and she did not let sentiment go unmatched, she added, "I love you too, deeply and specifically and with full knowledge of your flaws, which I feel I should mention because I think it is more meaningful than a general love." He said, "What are my flaws?" She said, "You are occasionally so determined to manage a situation on your own that you forget to tell me what you are managing until it is done, which I find mildly aggravating even when the results are good." He considered this. He said, "That is fair." She said, "I know it is." He said, "What else?" She said, "You are too hard on yourself about things that were not in your control, and it makes you quieter than is comfortable. When you go quiet like that, I have to work harder to reach you." He said, "And when you reach me," she said, "you are always worth the reaching." Outside, the Kansas winter was doing its thorough, impartial work. The lamplight was warm. In the back room, Patrick was sleeping with the heavy, uncomplicated sleep of a child who has run himself genuinely ragged. And Clara was in her small bed making the small sounds that meant she was deep in whatever dreams a 1-year-old has. And Thomas Brenner sat in his wife's father's house on his wife's father's land, which was also his land now, and looked at his wife across the lamplit table, and felt the thing in his chest that had been there since a summer afternoon in 1876 and had never once, in all the intervening years of distance and difficulty, gone anywhere at all. He said, "You have always been it for me." She looked up from the ledger. She said, "I know. You were always it for me too." She closed the ledger and held out her hand across the table, and he took it. She said, "We wasted some years." He said, "We did." She said, "We will not waste the rest." He said, "No, we will not." The spring of 1887 brought a new development that neither of them had planned, but that arrived with the quiet authority of things that simply are. A family from Missouri had purchased the old Brenner property, the farm where Thomas had grown up, and the husband, a man named Edgar Tillys, had an accident with a piece of farm equipment in May that left him unable to manage the heavier work for the remainder of the season. His wife, a woman named Ruth Tillys, had come across the fence line one morning with the particular look of a person swallowing considerable pride in the service of practical necessity, and she had asked Josephine if there was any possibility of help. Josephine had said yes before she had finished asking. Thomas had spent 3 days a week through the summer working the Tillys property alongside Edgar's eldest son, a 15-year-old boy named Damon who had his mother's practicality, and was learning the work with a focused attention that Thomas recognized and found personally satisfying to work with. The Tillys family and the Brenner family became the particular kind of neighbors that the frontier produced at its best, not intimate, but genuinely mutual, knowing that the other family would respond to a crisis with practical help rather than sympathy, which was what the land actually required. Samuel Holt, who had been with the Brenner farm for 3 years by 1887, had taken on enough skill and responsibility that Thomas trusted him with independent management of certain operations, which gave Thomas more flexibility in how he distributed his time. It also led, in the autumn of 1887, to Samuel presenting himself at the kitchen door one evening with an earnest expression and a question about whether Thomas had any objection to Samuel courting Damon Tilley's older sister, a 19-year-old woman named Annie Tilley's who had come to help her mother through the summer and had, apparently, caught Samuel's attention completely. Thomas had kept his face entirely neutral and said he had no objection whatsoever. Josephine, who had been at the table and had heard the entire exchange, waited until Samuel had left and then looked at Thomas with an expression of considerable amusement and said, "You handled that with remarkable composure for a man who was clearly suppressing a large smile." He said, "I was not suppressing anything." She said, "You absolutely were." He said, "He is a good man." She said, "He is, and she is a good woman." She paused. "It is rather like a mirror." He looked at her. She said, "A young man who works the land and a young woman who knows her own mind across a fence line in Kansas." He said, "The fence line was not involved in this situation." She said, "Not literally." He said, "Josephine." She said, "Thomas." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, and she laughed against his mouth, and from the back room Patrick's voice called out that he was thirsty, which was Patrick's reliable method of announcing that he had been awake the entire time and wanted involvement in whatever was happening. Thomas went and got him a cup of water. In 1888, Josephine was expecting their third child, and in the evenings she would sit in Patrick Dugan's old chair, which had remained in the kitchen through every rearrangement of the house, occupying the corner by the window as though it had been built into the structure. And she would review the accounts or read or simply sit with her hands in her lap and look out the south window toward where the two farms met at the old fence line, now a proper hedgerow that Thomas had established in the second year of their marriage. He would watch her in those evenings with the particular quality of attention that he had learned over 5 years of marriage was the truest form of love he had access to, not the dramatic, consuming love of crisis moments, though that had been there and was still there in quieter form, but the sustained, deliberate, daily attention to another person that is the actual substance of a life together. The noticing of her, the specific pleasure of her presence. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way she would occasionally look up from whatever she was reading and say something completely disconnected from any previous topic that turned out, on examination, to be the continuation of a thought she had been developing privately for some time. She was 29 years old, and she was the most remarkable person he had ever known, and he was 34 years old, and he had been in love with her for 12 years, and the fact of her had not dimmed or simplified with familiarity. It had only become more specific, more detailed, more essentially itself. The way you understand a landscape better the longer you live inside it. The third child was born in February of 1889, on a cold night with snow against the windows. Another boy, which Patrick, now 4 years old and possessed of strong views on many subjects, received as a personal disappointment that he expressed, and then revised when the baby demonstrated an interest in Patrick's activities that Patrick found acceptable. They named the new baby James William Brenner, the William for Thomas's father. Josephine held James and looked at Thomas across the bedroom in the February night and said, in a voice that was soft with tiredness and something else, "We have a good family." He said, "We have the best." She said, "You were worth waiting for." He came and sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand and held it and said, "You were worth every mile of the way back." She said, "The fence post." He said, "The fence post." She laughed, quiet in the winter night so as not to wake the baby. The year 1889 brought significant change to Kansas, as it had been bringing change to the entire territory for the preceding decade. The frontier was closing, not completely, not yet, but the closing was visible in the small ways that matter more than the large proclamations. There were more fences now, more roads, more families, more towns with brick buildings instead of wood, More rail connections that shrunk the distance between here and the rest of the country, until the particular isolation that had defined the frontier experience was becoming something that old-timers described to children who could not quite imagine it. The land that Patrick Dugan had built on in the years after the Civil War, when a man could stand in his field and see no other man's property in any direction, was now hemmed pleasantly by neighbors, by fence lines, by the routine of a community that had put down roots deep enough to survive drought and winter, and the relentless economic pressure that attended farming in the late 19th century. Thomas had watched this change with the particular perspective of a man who had been on both sides of the frontier's edge, who had lived outside its structures long enough to understand both their limitations and their value. The law was better here than it had been in 1878, not perfect, not without the corruption and the arbitrary application of power that had marked Harlan Voss's manipulation of the sheriff's office, but better, more accountable, more visible to the scrutiny of a community that was beginning to have the kind of civic muscle that comes from population density and shared investment. Harlan Voss had been convicted in 1883 on the fraud charges that Thomas's arrangement with the county records office had precipitated. He had served time in the state penitentiary and had been released in 1886, diminished in every way that mattered to a man like Voss financially, socially, professionally. He had gone back to St. Louis, and the Sumner County property scheme had been finished. The railroad had come through in 1885, and the Brenner Farms position along the line had indeed proved advantageous, though the advantage had been one that Josephine's careful management had captured rather than surrendered to a St. Louis investor. She had renegotiated her Wichita contract to accommodate direct rail shipment by 1886, which had increased her margin significantly and eliminated the freight middleman. "This is what he wanted," Thomas had said once, looking over the railroad line from the north field. Josephine had said, "He wanted to take it from us." "That is a different thing than what we have done with it." He had looked at her. He said, "Yes, it is." She said, "We built this ourselves." He said, "Together." She said, "Together." Samuel Holt had married Annie Tillies in the spring of 1888 and had taken a lease on a small property adjacent to the Brenner Farms west boundary, which worked out practically to everyone's advantage. Samuel remained closely connected to the Brenner operation while establishing his own household, and the relationship between the two farms became mutually reinforcing in the way that good neighboring works. Annie Tillies, who was indeed a woman who knew her own mind, proved to be an excellent match for Samuel's steady and earnest nature, and Josephine expressed considerable private satisfaction at this outcome, without ever quite admitting that she had recognized the likely trajectory early and had occasionally facilitated the opportunity. Thomas had asked her once, in 1889, if she had done any deliberate matchmaking. She had said, "I may have mentioned to Annie that Samuel was a particularly reliable and admirable person on several occasions." He had said, "And to Samuel." She had said, "I may have mentioned that Annie had a very sensible approach to farm economics and was additionally a very fine woman." He had said, "Josephine," she had said, "it worked." He had not been able to argue with that. Patrick grew into a boy who was unmistakably his mother's son in the particular fierceness of his intelligence, and equally his father's son in the quiet, observant quality of his watching. By the time he was 5, he was following Thomas through the morning chores with a focused attention that gradually became assistance, and by 6, he had opinions about feed ratios that were occasionally correct. Clara was more interior. She had Josephine's precision, but channeled it into drawing and later, into a love of the books on her grandfather's shelf that she worked through with the dedicated patience of someone who has found the thing that fits her exactly. James, the youngest, was something else entirely: sociable, loud, interested in everyone he met, which caused Thomas considerable private amusement since James appeared to have inherited no behavioral trait from either of his reserved parents. Life had a rhythm. The seasons were predictable in their unpredictability. The land was demanding and generous in the cycles that farming knowledge could anticipate. The children were growing in directions that surprised and delighted. The marriage was deep and specific and daily and alive. On an October evening in 1890, October again, which had become a month with particular weight in Thomas Brenner's personal chronology, he was sitting on the porch after supper watching the sun go down over the Kansas plain with the particular color of an October sky, which is not like any other sky, and Josephine came out and sat beside him, and they were quiet together for a while. She said, "Thomas," he said. She said, "Do you know what this evening is?" He thought about it. He said, 8 years, she said, 8 years since you rode in from the dark with the deed. He said, with the lamp burning at the post. She said, I had no idea if you would come. I only knew that I had heard your name, and I lit the lamp and waited. He said, you were always going to wait. She said, I was, though I would not have admitted it at the time. He said, what would you have said at the time? She said, I would have said I lit the lamp because I was expecting information about the deed situation, and it seemed prudent to keep a light. He said, and would you have believed that if you said it? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no, I knew when I lit the lamp who I was lighting it for. He looked at the sky. The sun was dropping below the horizon in that October way, the light going orange and then deep red along the flat edge of the plain. He said, you asked no questions. She said, I had all the answers I needed. You had ridden 4 days to bring me back something that belonged to my father. Everything else was detail. He said, the detail was significant. She said, all the significant details have been resolved, I believe. He looked at her in the October evening light, 8 years after a midnight and a lamp and a silence that had contained everything between them, and he said, yes, I believe they have. She put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the sky go dark over the Kansas plain, the first stars coming out above the south field, the lamp in the kitchen window visible through the glass, the sound of the children, Patrick reading to Clara and James, attempting to involve himself in the reading with the persistence of a 5-year-old who does not understand that the story is not for him audible through the front door. The farm was warm and lit and full. The land that Patrick Dugan had built and Josephine had defended and Thomas had returned to was quiet under the October sky, settled into itself, producing as land does when it is tended by people who understand that the relationship is reciprocal. The railroad hummed in the distance on clear nights when the wind was from the north. The fence lines were sound. The barn roof had not leaked through 4 winters. The drainage ditch in the south field had done exactly what they had argued it into doing. Thomas Brenner held his wife on the porch of the farm that was theirs together, the farm that had cost them both a great deal and had given them back more, and he felt the enormous, grounded, undeserved feeling rightness of a life that has found the shape it was meant to have. She said against his shoulder, I am glad you came back. He said, I was always coming back. She said, I know. She lifted her head and looked at him. I knew when I heard your name that night. Something in me knew. He said, something in me was always pointing here. She said, north, home. He said, that is the same direction. She smiled, and in the dark of the October evening with the lamplight at the window behind her and the first stars of the Kansas night overhead, Josephine Brenner looked at her husband with the full, clear-eyed, unhidden love of a woman who has chosen this person with her whole self and has been chosen equally fully in return. And the look between them was not the charged, uncertain look of that first midnight, all those years ago, but something else, something quieter and deeper and more durable. The look of 2 people who have made good on everything the harder look had promised. From inside the house, James announced at full volume that he was thirsty. Patrick told him he was always thirsty. Clara told both of them to be quiet. Thomas stood up from the porch steps and pulled Josephine to her feet and kissed her once, firmly and warmly, in the October dark. And then they went inside together to manage the small and irreplaceable logistics of the life they had built. The lamp was still burning when they came through the door. The way lamps in houses like theirs stay burning kept steady by the people inside, casting light on the table and the accounts and the shelf of books and the children and the years ahead, all the years still to come, all the ordinary and extraordinary things that a good life is made of, spread out before them like the Kansas plain under a clear October sky, wide and lit and endlessly open to the morning.